technology is still rather slow sometimes. So today, the Levant. That's a term which probably I've used several times, and it's probably a new term to most of you. But let's go back and think about what we learned last week. We learned that the Persian Empire that ruled the world, the Fertile Crescent was the largest empire up to that time in the Western world. It controlled up to 40% of the world's population. And we learned that the first great Persian ruler was Cyrus the Great, which we know from the Bible. We also know that he was followed by his son Cambyses II, who subjugated Egypt, and then he in turn was followed by Darius, who became one of the great Persian kings, the Immortals. We learned to begin a series of wars with the Greek city-states, which did not turn out well for Persia, and we're going to hear more about that later. He was followed by his son Xerxes, who also continued war with the Greeks, but is primarily the focus of the book of Esther. If you read the book of Esther in the Bible, it talks constantly about the Persian king, and that Persian king was Xerxes. We also learned that the Persian worshipped a religion known as Zoroastrianism, which is pretty much unknown today, but at that time had a very large influence on several of the religions in the Levant, including possibly Christianity in the first few centuries of AD, as Christianity was in its infancy. We also learned it was under the Persians that the Jewish people were restored to the Holy Lands, that Judah was seen once again to be occupied by the Hebrews, and the temple, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's what we learned last week. So today, we're going to head down into what we know as the Levant. This is a scene from the old ruins of Tyre in present-day Lebanon. It no longer exists, but it's along the coastline. That's the Mediterranean Sea in the background. But this is some of the ruins of the old city of Tyre, Tyre. Here's my Bible verse for the day. He has given an order concerning Phoenicia, that her fortresses be destroyed. He said, no more of your reveling, virgin daughter Sidon, now crushed. And this in the background is some of the old fortresses of Sidon that the Bible talks about in Isaiah, 23rd chapter, 11th, 12th verse. I always start with the cartoon, as you know. This one has Thack worked frantically to start a fire. A Cro-Magnon man walking up erect approached the table and simply gave Thena a light. So you got a Neanderthal down there trying to make fire, and the Cro-Magnon just walks up and lights her cigarette. So I thought that was kind of cute, kind of irreverent, but that's okay. So the Levant. What do we mean by the Levant? You don't hear that term very often anymore. It's kind of out of vogue. It was primarily a term that was used through the Middle Ages and up through the 19th century, and onwards from the 20th century, it's kind of lost its favor. No one uses it much anymore. But it's a really good historical term because it does talk about a geographical area that was definitely different from Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and also different from the Egyptian Nile River Valley. It's the area that primarily was made up of the current countries of Syria, Lebanon. Today, those are all independent countries, but back in this time and day, it was kind of a fluid situation there. And so in a general term, we use the term Levant to discuss this part of this area that kind of ran along the coastline from primarily the Mesopotamian River Valley to the Nile River Valley. It's an Italian term. It means rising, and it refers to the eastern place where the sun rose. kind of, from Rome, where they would have looked across the sea, Levant. In ancient times, it was home to a lot of nomadic tribes and a whole lot of city-states and small kingdoms. You would have found these tribes in the Levant: the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Amorites, and the Phoenicians. These are all talked about in the Bible. Together, they're primarily known as the tribes of Canaan, the Canaanite tribes. So when the Bible talks about the Canaanites, they're talking about these tribes. They're talking about the area of the Levant. But for our purposes, we're going to primarily concern ourselves with three of these tribes. We're going to talk about the Aramaeans. We're going to talk about the Phoenicians. We're going to talk about both those today. And then we're going to spend about 3 weeks on the Hebrews. None of these tribes politically were very important. When you look at them in comparison to the Assyrians or the Hittites or the Persians or the Egyptians, they were microscopic in terms of political power. But boy, have they left a lasting cultural impact upon this world. And for that reason, we're going to talk about them. And today we'll talk about the Aramaeans, as I said, and primarily the Phoenicians. And then for the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about ancient Israel. We're going to go through the history of ancient Israel and kind of correlate it with the Bible. And I'll show you some archaeological discoveries that tend to support the biblical stories. And I think you'll find it very interesting. So let's look today at the Aramaeans and the Phoenicians. This is kind of a map of the Levant. You can see up here, this is the Assyrian Empire at the top. And then this was the kingdom of Aram Damascus, which primarily Aram Damascus is present-day Syria. And then you had Lebanon up here along the coastline. And then you had the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. That was after they split after Solomon's rule. This would have been the Philistine states, present-day Gaza, and what is referred to often as Palestine. Over here, you had the kingdom of Ammon and the kingdom of Moab, which together kind of make up Jordan. And down here, you have the kingdom of Edom, which is also part Jordan and also part of Israel. So that was the Levant. So let's first of all talk about the Aramaeans. We're not going to spend a long time on the Aramaeans, but they had a really important part. They played a really important part in the culture of the Bible. The Aramaeans were a Semitic-speaking tribe who originated in the central region as Aram. In the Bible, Syria is often referred to as Aram. It was like most an indigenous tribe, and they were nomads. They made a living raising sheep, primarily cattle, just following the herds. There was no really cities as such. They reached their power about 900 BC. And the Aramaeans at this time kind of had a little kingdom called Aram Damascus, and they actually were pretty strong. In fact, the case in the Bible in 2 Kings that talks about the king of Aram Damascus called Hazael. And he's actually mentioned about 24 times in the Bible. And it says Hazael, who is in those territory, 2 Kings 10:32. By the end of the 8th century, they became a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire, and they primarily had a policy. Oops, I don't know how I did that. Let's go back here. Sorry about that. They had a policy of relocation to reduce threats from conquered tribes. So, as a result of all this, the Aramaeans were spread throughout the Assyrian Empire. The effect of that was that the Aramaean language became the commonly spoken language of not only the Levant, but also the Mesopotamian River Valley, and to some degree even over into Egypt. Now, I'm not a linguist. I can't tell you why Aramaic became so widely spoken. I suppose it was probably simply learned. That would be my guess, that probably it was a lot easier to learn than maybe some of the other language. It became known as the lingua franca of the region. The importance to us is this. This is without a doubt the language Jesus spoke. He spoke. So when Jesus was doing his ministry, when he was giving his Sermon on the Mount, when he was working with his band of apostles and going from city to city, trying to convert the people to his ministry, he was speaking Aramaic. There is no doubt about it. He was probably also bilingual. We are certain he read Hebrew because he would have had to. He obviously went to Hebrew school, but he was very knowledgeable about the Old Testament and the Torah. And so obviously Jesus would have had to have read Hebrew. He probably had some knowledge of Greek, probably not a wide knowledge of Greek. He probably didn't speak Greek fluently by any means at all. But Greek was the kind of official language even of the Roman Empire at that time. And so probably Greek would have been he probably would have had some knowledge of the Greek language. But without a doubt, his spoken language was Aramaean. So that's the importance of Aramaean. This is their alphabet. You can see it there. You can see how that was influenced. So let's go down next. Okay. Having a little trouble with my slides here. I'm sorry. Okay. So the rest of the time we're going to talk about the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians had a huge impact upon Western civilization. Today, they're not remembered very much. And like I said, they never had a political power or anything like that, but they had a huge power, a cultural impact upon Western civilization, just like the Lebanon, primarily along the coast. And Phoenicia would have been made up of a series of what we call autonomous city-states, like Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and each one of these were independent. If you would have gone to one of these ancient cities at this time and say you go to Tyre and you would have talking about, they considered themselves Tyrrhenians or Sidonites or Byblosians. They would have not considered themselves Phoenician. Phoenicia was the term that was later applied to them as a group, but they didn't work, with. They didn't have a nation as such. It was just a whole group of city-states. They were all along the coast, and they were all maritime city-states. That is, they primarily were city-states that came and went on the sea. The term Phoenicia itself came from an ancient Greek term for a unique purple, the murex seashell. And I can't tell you how important this was, folks. The culture of the ancient world was pretty drab. A lot of browns, a lot of grays, a lot of black and whites. And so if they wanted color in their life, they had to do it either through dyes or some of this in their clothing. One of the most sought after dye colors was purple because it was so rare. Red and yellows and some of these other colors were, but purple was a really unique and hard to find color. And about the only place you could find it was through this murex seashell. It became so important that later on in the Roman Empire, purple was adopted as the color of royalty, of the elite of the Roman Empire. And it was actually against the law to wear purple unless you belonged to a certain group of people within the Roman Empire. That was how they identified themselves. So this purple dye that was found in Phoenicia was an extremely hot commodity. They would take this and they would trade it for gold and silver and all sorts of other things, and it made them extremely, wealthy. Phoenicia, as a group of city-states, came to power about 1150, about the time when the rest of the area was kind of in decline, something called the Bronze Age collapse that we've talked about. And they kind of got together and they established an expansive maritime trade network. Remember, they're all along the coast of Lebanon. They're all seagoing nations. And so they would have had a really big, powerful impact. Here's kind of a map that kind of shows you the commercial network of the Venetians. Here would have been Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, the three major cities. There were others, but these were the three major ones. You can see that they had a colony on Cyprus as well as Crete. They actually had colonies along the coast of Egypt. Here's Cyrene, Leptis. They had colonies in Sicily and Sardinia, all the way around to where we now call the Straits of Gibraltar and Tangiers. There's even indications they actually were further out into the Atlantic Oceans. There's even some indications they may have actually reached the island of Britain. I don't know that I buy that. But here is the big one, Carthage. Carthage was a very important colony. It was the most important Phoenician colony. Look here, there's only 100 miles between Sicily and Carthage. If you controlled Carthage, you controlled the Straits of Sicily here, the Messina Straits, and they absolutely controlled this. You kind of controlled the whole Mediterranean Sea if you controlled this. They also controlled this area here, the Straits of Gibraltar, as we now know it. So they really had a kind of a monopoly upon the Mediterranean Sea for a long time and the trade routes. And they put these colonies out here and they would sail back and forth trading different things with them. So these three, actually more than that, Phoenician city-states were extremely powerful as far as trade. Ancient writers described the Phoenicians as expert sailors and boat builders. They were kind of the premier boat builders and sailors of the ancient world, at least until the Greeks came along. Their success in part was due to their ships. They were built for speed. They were built for maneuverability in the Mediterranean Sea, which can get extremely rough. Later on, the Egyptians adopted their boats, called them biblos boats. And after that, the Greek city-states adopted the Phoenician boat design, and they called them triremes. And the Greeks eventually overpowered the Phoenicians and took charge of the Mediterranean Sea. They became the primary trade center in the Mediterranean Sea for some years, at least until the Romans finally took over. The trireme had three ranks of rowers, and they also had something called a cutwater, which was kind of a point at the end of the boat, and the cutwater would actually slice through the seas. And modern day boats are kind of built on that whole concept of having what was called a cutwater. And I mentioned that they established all these different colonies along the Mediterranean basin, including Cyprus, Sicily, Sardinia, Rhodes, Malta, and most importantly, Carthage. So what did they trade? Well, they traded wood. Wood was kind of a commodity that's in not very large supply in what we now call the Middle East. You don't find a lot of wood. One of the areas where you found a lot of wood was up in the mountains right to the east of these Phoenician city-states, called the Cedars of Lebanon. And of course, that was in the Bible. David and Solomon used cedar to help build David his palace, and Solomon the temple. Talks about lining the walls with cedar wood. The fragrance of the cedar smelled great. It was beautiful wood. And I'll bet you a whole bunch of you still have cedar lined chests or dresser drawers, or have bags of cedar in your closet. This was very common. They also, of course, traded the Tyrrhenian purple, the Murex seashell purple. They were very good cloth makers, and they decorated their cloth with what we now call embroidery. And again, this was something that was kind of new. The women were very good with this. They made wine. They traded wine. They also were very good at making glass. They were amongst some of the first glass makers in the Western civilization. And finally, they were very good at making pottery jars, what we call amphoras. And these jars were often used to hold the wine. So these were the kind of commodities that they traded throughout the Western world. And like I said, they became extremely wealthy off this. Here's one of the amphoras, and this is some of the early Phoenician. These, of course, down here are the Cedars of Lebanon, the mountains, which exist today. There are not as many of them by any means at all. And of course, that's the purple Murex seashell, which gave off this purple dye, which they used to create Tyrrhenian purple, as it was called. So let's talk a little bit about Carthage, because Carthage was indeed the Phoenicians' primary colony. It established Carthage about 814 BC, located on the coast of present-day country of Tunisia, kind of where Tunis is today. And again, it was so strategically placed because it kind of controlled that very narrow crossing between Sicily and Carthage. About 100 miles is all. And they kind of had a bottleneck on the Mediterranean. So it was an extremely important trading colony. They built the city up into one of the largest cities of actually the ancient world that had two harbors. Both of them built, they were artificial harbors. One of them was for harboring the mercantile trade boats, the other was for harboring military boats. The naval power had a walled tower overlooking the harbor, and the city itself had walls. Eventually, Carthage broke free from Phoenician control around 650 and developed its own civilization. And of course, if you know your ancient history at all, you know that later on, Carthage, as an independent country, came into conflict with the Roman Republic. And there was a series of wars with Rome called the Punic Wars between 264 and 1146 BC, which were extremely important. And we know them primarily because of one thing: the fact that the leader of the Carthaginian forces, a man by the name of Hannibal, tried to come across the Alps, the mountains that guard the northern regions of Rome and Italy, and he used elephants, which threw fear into the Romans, because they had never, nobody darn near defeating the Romans. Had he defeated them, the whole world would have been different. I can guarantee you the Romans, if they had been defeated by the Carthaginians, you would have not had the Roman Empire. If you would not had the Roman Empire, I'm not for sure today exactly how the world would look. But it was an extremely important war. And we're going to talk more about that as we get into the Roman civilization later on in the presentations. So this is a little bit about Carthage. Some of you may remember the movie Patton. Patton was the movie about the World War II general for America, George Patton. And the first of the movie, if you've seen it, he's walking around in North Africa. He's walking around these ruins, and he's talking with his aide. And George Patton apparently was a believer in reincarnation. And he believed he was a reincarnated Hannibal. And I mean, apparently he really believed this. And he was walking around describing the battle for Carthage. And this aide says, "Well, you really know a lot about this, don't you?" And he looked at his aide and he said, "I was here." I don't know if that actually happened, but the movie portrays it as Pat and walk around the old ruins of Carthage. It's advisory. Uh, it uses a lot of salty language. So if you're not used to salty language, you probably don't need to listen to Patton because it does have a lot of it in there for sure. Because he himself used a lot of what we now call here in the Ozarks the King's English. This is a painting of the old ruins of the city-state of Carthage, as you can see. So this is the biggie. All this other stuff is important. The founding of Carthage, the trading, the maritime trade, but without a doubt, what's important, the lasting legacy of Phoenicia was its alphabet. They were responsible for the development of the first true alphabet in the world. It's thought that it derived from the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it's what we call a phonetic alphabet. That term is from the Phoenicians. I'm sure most of you have heard about phonics. I'm sure most of you remember learning your alphabet and learning the sounds. And I was taught to read by phonics. I don't know how much of that is being taught anymore. It's kind of, maybe that's one of the reasons a lot of kids can't read anymore. But at that time, it was a very important thing. And because each letter represented a sound. In the past, the alphabets were basically signs, they were drawings of things. Something like this. It was symbolic, developed an alphabet which represented sounds. As a result, they only needed a couple of dozen symbols. Pastor Dwayne was telling me that one of his sons, who lives in China, had to learn, he's very fluent in one of the Chinese dialects. He had to learn 30,000 symbols in Chinese to be able to master the language. We have to learn 26. They had to learn 30,000. So, this was a revolution, folks. This was one of the most revolutionary things in world history. And it's all due to the Phoenicians because they developed the first genuine sound phonic alphabets. It influenced Hebrew, it influenced Aramaic, it influenced Greece, it influenced Latin, it influenced almost every modern Western language. So this is an extremely important development. In fact, case it is so important that historians rank it right up as maybe the single most important contribution of any civilization from the ancient world. I don't know that I would rank it that high, but it definitely is ranked in the contributions of any civilization. I think you have to also rank democracy up there from the Greeks. Obviously, you have to rank Christianity up there. But the important thing is that this was one of the single most important contributions, and it came from an extremely small city-state, group of city-states that really had no political power. But that shows you how cultural powers can sometimes be more lasting and influential than political power. This is the old phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians. And if you look at it, you can actually see the origin, some of our language, some of our letters. For instance, this is obviously R backwards, but still an R. This is obviously an A. An E, again backwards with a little bit of a leg. You got a Y. You got a Z, which is a little bit different, but it's still, you can see the kind of diagonal there, the H. You can go on and on and on. The K. you can see the influence that this had upon later on English, as well as Greece, as well as Latin. All these languages had some, origin with the phonetic alphabet of the Phoenicians. Now, what about their religion? If you read the Bible, there is no more evil, hated group of religions in the world than Canaanite religions. They were the arch enemies of the Hebrews in the Old Testament. Obviously, that has to do with the fact that they were the Hebrew area, and with the Canaanite religions, one of being the Phoenicians, had some practices which really went against the whole concept of, the Hebrew language. For instance, again, they were all polytheistic. They were anthropomorphic. They were animistic. That means that they worshiped many gods. Their gods often took human form. And they also worshiped natural occurrences. It's kind of hard to discuss the Phoenician pantheon, the group of gods, because every city-state had their own number of gods. Remember, these city-states of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos and some of these other city-states that made up what we now call Phoenicia, they really didn't consider themselves a country. They considered themselves just a city-state. So, and kind of come up with some that were kind of common, let's say, to all the different groups of Canaan tribes. Probably one of them was El, the supreme God, the father of all mankind. He had a son, Baal, Baals, as we call him. He was the weather god and considered the son of El seafarers. You had a fertility goddess named Asherah, which also was known as Ishtar, was also known as Astarte. She was known by several different names throughout the Canaanite tribes. And then you had kind of a god of war, which was Melkort, also known as Marduk, also known as, I can't recall right now, also he was given other names also, which throughout the Bible, these are mentioned. All grouped together, they were often called Baals. And this is a Baal statue, which was uncovered in archaeology. And when you read the Bible, the Baals were extremely the sign of evil. Shrines to the gods were usually placed on hilltops or high places, and usually they centered around an Asherah pole, where they worshiped the fertility goddess. And here they would have their dances and their rituals. And be honest about it, most of them turned into, one of the reasons that they were so offensive to the Hebrews. There's 134 references to Baal in the Bible. This is one of them. There's lots of them, but this is just one of them. It says, the same night the Lord said to him, Gideon, this is the book of Judges, take this second bull from your father's herd, the one that's 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Judges 6:25. Later on, the prophets just railed against the Baals, mainly because they, like I said, they were such an immoral religion. They had temple prostitution. There's obviously evidence that they practiced child sacrifice a lot. All this, of course, was prohibited by Mosaic law. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. Leviticus 21:2. Obviously, we wouldn't think about that today. But apparently back in these days, there was enough of that going around that Moses felt compelled to write this down in the book of Leviticus, that basically child sacrifice was not to be done. We don't know exactly how widespread child sacrifice was amongst the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, but apparently it was strong enough that it needed to be, written down and talked about a lot in the Old Testament. Uh, Don't know what I did there. Okay. This is an Asherah pole. This is an archaeological site up on a hilltop where they found one of the old Canaanite ritual grounds, and this is one of the Asherah poles, standing upright. What was the relationship between the Hebrews and the Phoenicians? Well, as I've said, religion became the embodiment of evil to the Hebrews. But there was a period of time when apparently the Hebrews and Phoenicians got along a little bit better than we might have thought. Just think about it. This is from 1 Kings 5:11. King David and King Hiram of Tyre seemed to be on particular good terms. It said he sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. So, believe it or not, according to the Bible, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, actually built David's palace primarily. At the same time, in First Kings, it also talks about when Solomon hired workers from Byblos prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. So David and Solomon apparently were a little bit more pragmatic, maybe, than some of the kings and the leaders of the Hebrews, because they were not adverse to using some of the stonemasons and the craftsmen and all this from the Phoenician colonies, the Phoenician city-states, to help build the temples and the palaces. Of course, later on, they really got down on the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. And remember Elijah. Elijah just absolutely went apoplectic over King Ahab, who married a Phoenician princess whose name was Jezebel. I'm sure you all remember this from your Bible. She encouraged Abraham to install Canaanite temples and priests throughout the land, and this in turn spelled doom for Ahab and Jezebel. Elijah just absolutely went out of his way to absolutely make life miserable for Ahab and Jezebel. And the Bible says there was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by his wife Jezebel. That's 1 Kings 21:25. If you know your Bible, you know that Ahab eventually dies, and Jezebel, who hangs around for a while, eventually meets her doom as prophesied by Elijah. It says, as for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. And it says in the Bible that one of the kings of the attacking forces ordered some of the slaves to push Jezebel out of second-story window, and when she fell to the ground, wild dogs devoured her. And kind of a gruesome end, to say the least. But that's how bad that the Hebrews and the Phoenicians primarily got along. This is one of the famous paintings by Frederick Clayton, Jezebel, Ahab, and Elijah. It's a very famous Renaissance painting, and it shows Ahab and Jezebel here and the prophet Elijah in his prophesying against them. So what happened to Phoenicia? Well, Phoenicia went the way of almost every other country in the ancient world at this period of time. They were gobbled up by the Persians. They lost Carthage. The Persians took them over. Later on, they were taken over by Alexander the Great. And of course, all that was gobbled up by the Roman Empire. So today, the Phoenicians kind of stayed where they were. They were gobbled up, but they were kind of left alone because of their abilities and their trading, their mercantilisms, and most importantly, their ability to make boats, which a lot of these countries used them as maritime naval forces. So This is the end of Carthage, Phoenicia, and this is the old ruins of Carthage. That kind of ends this. So next week, we're going to start the study of ancient Israel. I'm going to go through the primary timeline, the high points of the Bible and the Old Testament, but I'm going to concentrate primarily upon archaeological supports the biblical story. That's my goal. That's my mission in all this, is kind of leading up to this next 3 weeks where we talk about the Old Testament and how they fell apart eventually. And then we'll take it up a little bit later with the Greeks. And then we'll also, of course, when the Roman Empire came along, was the rise of Christianity, which we'll be talking about from that. But the next 3 weeks are going to be talking about ancient Israel. And so I hope you'll be with me. I think you'll enjoy it. We're going to get into the actual meat of this whole presentation for the next 3 weeks. So I thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kaylin.